In a Chicago dining room, a 67-year-old widow was about to shatter her family's assumptions. What started as Sunday dinner took a shocking turn when they dismissed her travel dreams as, quote, too dangerous. Florence Miller wasn't your typical fragile senior. For decades, she had been the family's anchor, known for her quiet resilience through her husband's cancer battle. When her children called her too fragile for solo travel, she had no idea this moment would ignite her rebellion. Florence made a decision that would lead to postcards from 7 countries, proving that the most powerful journeys begin with a single act of defiance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Florence Miller's dining room held the same Sunday ritual it had maintained for 47 years, until Robert died. Now the mahogany table that once seated 8 felt cavernous with just 3 chairs occupied. The late afternoon light filtered through lace curtains that needed washing, casting shadows across the remnants of a pot roast dinner that none of them had particularly enjoyed. "The Morrisons are talking about selling," Sarah said, picking at her mashed potatoes. "Moving to one of those active communities in Arizona." Michael straightened in his chair, his lawyer's instincts sensing an opening. "That's not a bad idea. Mom, have you given any more thought to what we discussed? There are some excellent senior living facilities." "I'm not moving anywhere," Florence interrupted, her voice carrying more steel than her children expected. She set down her fork with deliberate precision. "Actually, I've been thinking about traveling." The word hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Sarah glanced nervously between her mother and brother, recognizing the familiar tightening around Michael's eyes. "Traveling where, Mom?" Sarah asked carefully. Florence felt something stirring in her chest, a flutter of the woman she used to be. "Portugal. I've always wanted to see Lisbon." The words came out stronger than she'd planned, surprising even herself. Michael's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "Mom, be realistic. You can barely manage the grocery store without getting confused about which aisle." "That happened once," Florence said quietly. "One time, in 40 years of shopping at Dominic's." "It's not just that." Michael leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone he used with difficult clients. "Dad's been gone 2 years. You haven't driven anywhere alone except the doctor and church. You've never traveled internationally without him, never been on a plane by yourself. And now you want to go to a foreign country where you don't speak the language?" Florence's fingers traced the edge of her water glass. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she could see herself at 25, sitting in this same chair, showing Robert pictures from a National Geographic spread on Portuguese beaches. "Someday," he'd said, kissing the top of her head, "when the kids are older, when work settles down, when we have more money." "Someday" had stretched into decades, then disappeared entirely with his diagnosis. "I speak some Portuguese," she said, though it wasn't true. "I've been studying." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I think what Michael's trying to say is that it might be overwhelming. Maybe we could plan something together? A family trip to, I don't know, Florida?" The condescension in her daughter's voice was gentle but unmistakable. Florence felt heat rising in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. When had her own children begun speaking to her, as if she were made of glass? "I don't want to go to Florida with you," Florence said evenly. "I want to go to Portugal. Alone." Michael set down his fork with the sharp clink of metal against china. "Mom, listen to yourself. You're talking about international travel, navigating foreign airports, dealing with customs, finding your way around a strange city. You haven't even renewed your passport since the 90s. "I can get a new passport. This isn't about paperwork." Michael's voice rose slightly, the way it did when he was losing an argument in court. "It's about reality. You're not 25 anymore. You're fragile, whether you want to admit it or not. What happens if you fall? What if you get sick? What if someone takes advantage of you?" Fragile. The word hit Florence like a physical blow. She stared at her son. This man she'd raised, whose scraped knees she'd bandaged, whose nightmares she'd chased away, and saw a stranger. When had he stopped seeing her as his mother? and started seeing her as his burden. "I raised 2 children," Florence said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I managed a household budget through 3 recessions. I nursed your father through 18 months of cancer treatments, coordinating doctors and insurance and medications, while he was too weak to remember his own name some days. But you think I'm too fragile to visit a country that has been successfully hosting tourists for centuries?" Sarah reached across the table, her hand hovering near Florence's. "Mom, we know you're capable. That's not what we're saying. It's just, why now? Why alone? If you really want to travel, we could all go together next summer. Make it a family thing." Florence pulled her hand away. She could feel tears threatening, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage. Clean, clarifying anger that she hadn't allowed herself to feel since Robert's funeral, when everyone had patted her shoulder and told her how strong she was being. "Because I'm 67 years old," she said. "Because every day I wait is a day I might not have. Because your father and I spent 45 years saying someday, and someday never came for him." Michael's expression softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. "Mom, I understand you're still grieving." "Don't." Florence stood abruptly, her chair scraping against hardwood. "Don't you dare psychoanalyze me. I'm not having a breakdown. I'm not being impulsive. I'm making a decision about my own life." "A dangerous decision," Michael said, standing as well. His 6-foot frame towered over his mother's 5'3", but Florence didn't step back. "Mom, I love you, we both do, but I won't support this foolishness. I won't help you plan something that could get you hurt, or worse." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at her plate, caught between her mother's fierce independence and her brother's protective fear. Florence looked at her children, really looked at them, and saw the exact moment when she'd lost their respect. It hadn't been when Robert died. It had been gradual, erosive, like water wearing away stone. Each time she'd let Michael handle her finances. Each time she'd accepted Sarah's gentle suggestions about what she should or shouldn't do. Each time she'd agreed that yes, maybe she was getting too old to drive at night, to shovel her own walk, to make decisions about her own life. "I see," Florence said finally. She began clearing the dinner plates with methodical precision, stacking them the way she'd done thousands of times before. "Well, thank you both for your input." Michael frowned. Something in his mother's tone set off alarm bells, but he couldn't identify exactly what. "Mom, we're not trying to control you, we're trying to protect you." Florence paused in her clearing, a serving dish balanced in her hands. "The Morrisons, you said? They're 73 and 75. But they're moving to Arizona, starting over. No one's calling them fragile." "That's different," Sarah said quickly. "They're moving together to a community designed for seniors." "They're older than I am," Florence continued, as if Sarah hadn't spoken. "But somehow they're capable of making major life decisions, and I'm not capable of booking a plane ticket." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving her children sitting in uncomfortable silence. Through the doorway, they could hear her running water, the familiar sounds of dishes being washed. It was such a normal sound that they almost missed the significance of what had just happened. Florence Miller, who had spent 2 years accepting their well-meaning restrictions, their gentle guidance, their loving control, had just drawn a line in the sand. Hours later, after Michael and Sarah had left with promises to talk more about this soon, Florence sat in Robert's old study. The room still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, though she'd cleared out his pipes months ago. His atlas lay open on the desk where she'd found it, the pages yellow with age but the maps still clear. Portugal stared back at her from the page, a small country on Europe's western edge. She traced the coastline with her finger, following it down to Lisbon. The city's name was printed in small, precise letters, but to Florence it looked as large as a promise. Her laptop, a gift from Tyler that she'd barely learned to use, hummed quietly on the desk beside the atlas. The browser window showed search results for Portugal Travel Guide, dozens of websites promising to help her plan the perfect trip. She'd been reading for 2 hours, absorbing information about flights and hotels and currency exchange rates. Each new page she visited felt like a small act of rebellion. The house was quiet around her, holding its breath. In her bedroom upstairs, Robert's clothes still hung in half the closet. In the kitchen, she still set out 2 coffee cups each morning before remembering. The life she'd built here felt simultaneously precious and suffocating, like a beautiful room with no windows. Florence closed the atlas and opened a new browser tab. The cursor blinked in the search bar. Waiting. She typed slowly, using 2 fingers. Flights Chicago to Lisbon. The results appeared instantly. Dozens of options, different airlines, and times and prices. She felt a flutter of panic at the complexity of it all, but underneath the panic was something else. Excitement. Pure, undiluted possibility. Her phone buzzed. A text from Michael. "Mom, I know you're upset about dinner. Let's talk tomorrow. I can take the afternoon off. We can look at some local travel options together. Love you." Florence stared at the message for a long moment. Local travel options. Day trips to Wisconsin, perhaps. A guided bus tour to see the fall colors. Safe, supervised adventures appropriate for someone too fragile for real travel. She deleted the message without responding and turned back to the computer screen. The cheapest flight was $847. The most expensive was over $3,000. The numbers swam before her eyes, not because she couldn't understand them, but because they represented something she'd never done before. A choice made entirely for herself, by herself. Florence Miller clicked on the cheapest option and began reading the fine print. Outside her window, Chicago settled into night, but inside Robert's study, lit by the warm glow of the computer screen, a woman was planning her escape. "Out that Portugal trip, are you? After what we talked about on Sunday?" Florence felt something harden in her chest. "What we talked about was you and Michael deciding what I'm capable of without asking me." That's not what happened. Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, her expression shifting from concern to something that looked almost like fear. "Mom, we love you. We just want you to be safe." Safe. Florence tested the word like it tasted bitter. "Do you know what's not safe, Sarah? Sitting in this house for the next 20 years, waiting to die. Letting everyone else make decisions about my life because they think I'm too old to make them myself." Quote, Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, that's not fair. We don't think you're too old. We just think international travel is. It's a big step. Maybe we could start smaller? A trip to California to see Aunt Helen?" Florence felt the familiar weight of well-meaning limitations settling over her like a heavy blanket. Every suggestion was reasonable, practical, safe, and completely missing the point. "I don't want to visit Aunt Helen," Florence said quietly. "I want to see the world your father and I never got to see. I want to prove to myself, and to you and Michael, that I'm still capable of having adventures." Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering her mother's. "You don't have to prove anything to us." "Don't I?" Florence's voice was sad rather than angry. "When did you stop believing I could take care of myself?" The question hung between them, unanswered and unanswerable. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again, recognizing the trap. Any answer would be an admission that, yes, they had stopped believing in their mother's competence somewhere along the way. After Sarah left, with promises to support whatever you decide that they both knew were hollow, Florence returned to her planning with renewed determination. She pulled the brochures from their hiding place, reopened her laptop, and continued where she'd left off. Florence's hands shook as she zipped her suitcase closed for the 3rd time that morning. The small wheeled bag sat on her bed like a quiet declaration of independence, packed with 3 weeks' worth of carefully chosen clothes and the kind of optimism she hadn't felt in decades. Her flight to Lisbon departed in 4 hours, but as far as Michael knew, she was heading to her weekly appointment with Dr. Stevens. The deception sat heavy in her stomach. In 67 years, Florence Miller had never been a liar. She'd been the kind of mother who insisted on honesty, who could detect a fib from across the room, who'd raised her children to believe that integrity was non-negotiable. Now she was about to commit the most elaborate deception of her life, and the irony wasn't lost on her. Her phone buzzed. A text from Michael. "Hope your appointment goes well today, Mom. Call me afterward. We still need to talk about that travel idea." Florence stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of her wanted to confess everything, to tell him the truth and face whatever consequences came with it. But she could already hear his voice, shocked, angry, betrayed. He would try to stop her, might even show up at the airport. The thought of that confrontation, public and humiliating, made her decision easier. She typed back, "We'll call later, love you." It wasn't technically a lie. She would call later, from Portugal. The taxi driver was a cheerful Jamaican man named Winston, who helped her load the suitcase into his trunk without comment about her age or apparent lack of companions. As they pulled away from the house she'd lived in for 43 years, Florence felt a moment of pure terror. The familiar neighborhoods of her life rolled past the window: the grocery store where she'd shopped for decades, the church where she'd married Robert, the park where she'd pushed her children on swings, each landmark a reminder of everything she was leaving behind. "First time traveling?" Winston asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "First time alone," Florence admitted. "Ah, that's different. Where are you heading?" "Portugal." Winston's face lit up in the mirror. "Beautiful country. My wife and I went there for our anniversary. You're gonna love it." His casual confidence that she could handle this journey, that she would love it, sent a warm rush through Florence's chest. Here was another stranger who didn't see her as fragile, who assumed competence rather than incapability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Quote dot. "Any advice?" she asked. "Don't try to see everything at once. Pick a few things that really matter to you and savor them. Travel isn't about checking boxes. It's about paying attention." Florence tucked this wisdom away as they approached O'Hare International Airport. The massive terminal complex loomed before them, busier and more intimidating than she remembered from her few previous flights with Robert. Cars and buses and shuttles created a choreographed chaos that seemed designed to overwhelm anyone over 30. "Terminal 5 for international departures," Winston said, pulling up to the curb. "You need help getting inside?" "I think I can manage." Florence surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. Winston helped her retrieve her suitcase and refused her offer of an extra tip. "You're doing something brave," he said simply. "Enjoy every minute of it." The check-in process proved less daunting than Florence had feared. The airline representative, a patient woman named Keisha, walked her through each step with the kind of professional kindness that made Florence feel like a valued customer, rather than a confused elderly person. Her passport, crisp and new, with its ominous expiration date 10 years in the future, passed inspection without comment. "First time to Portugal?" Keisha asked as she printed Florence's boarding pass. "First time anywhere, really." "Oh, honey, you picked a wonderful place to start. My cousin lives in Lisbon. Says it's the most beautiful city in Europe." She handed Florence the boarding pass with a genuine smile. "Gate M12. You'll want to be there about an hour before boarding. Have a wonderful trip." Security proved more challenging. Florence fumbled with her shoes, forgot about the liquids in her carry-on, and felt increasingly flustered as the line backed up behind her. But the TSA agent, a woman about Sarah's age, was patient and encouraging. "Take your time, ma'am. We've all been there." Once through security, Florence found herself in the international terminal with 2 hours to kill. The space was vast and gleaming, filled with shops selling everything from Chicago deep dish pizza to luxury handbags. Travelers from dozens of countries moved through the corridors with the easy confidence of people who belonged in this world. Florence bought a coffee and a newspaper, settling into a seat near her gate where she could watch the planes taxi on the runways. Each aircraft represented someone's journey, someone's adventure. In a few hours, she would be on one of those planes, crossing an ocean to a continent she'd only seen in photographs. Her phone rang. Michael. Florence stared at the screen, her heart racing. She could answer, confess everything, let him talk her out of this crazy adventure. Or she could let it go to voicemail and deal with the consequences later. The phone stopped ringing. A minute later, it chimed with a voicemail notification. She didn't listen to it. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now boarding flight 1847 to Lisbon, with connections available to cities throughout Europe. We'll begin with our premium passengers and those requiring special assistance. Florence's hands trembled as she gathered her carry-on bag. This was it, the point of no return. Once she boarded that plane, she would be committed to the most audacious act of her life. The gate agent was a young man with the kind of easy smile that suggested he genuinely enjoyed his job. "Traveling alone today?" he asked as he scanned Florence's boarding pass. "Yes." The word came out stronger than she felt. "Well, you picked a great time of year for Portugal. The weather should be perfect." Florence made her way down the jet bridge on unsteady legs, her wheeled bag bumping along behind her. The plane was enormous, bigger than any aircraft she'd ever boarded. Flight attendants smiled and directed passengers to their seats with practiced efficiency. Her seat was 23F, a window seat she'd specifically requested. As she settled in, stowing her bag in the overhead compartment, with help from a helpful passenger, Florence felt a mix of terror and exhilaration that made her dizzy. The woman in the middle seat was roughly her age, with silver hair and the kind of comfortable clothing that suggested an experienced traveler. She smiled as Florence sat down. "Going to Lisbon?" she asked. "Yes. You?" "Meeting my daughter there. She's studying abroad for the semester." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Carol, by the way." "Florence. First time to Portugal?" Florence nodded, suddenly feeling like a fraud among all these experienced travelers. "Oh, you're in for such a treat. I've been 3 times now, and it never gets old. Are you traveling alone?" The question, asked without judgment or concern, surprised Florence. "Yes. Good for you. Solo travel is the best kind of travel. You get to do exactly what you want, when you want to do it." Carol pulled out a well-worn guidebook. "If you don't mind a suggestion, you absolutely must visit the Fado houses in the Alfama district. Traditional Portuguese music that will break your heart in the most beautiful way." Back in Chicago, Michael Miller stood in his mother's driveway, pressing the doorbell for the 3rd time. Her car was in the garage, but she wasn't answering the door. He'd called twice since morning, both calls going to voicemail. A familiar anxiety gnawed at his stomach, the same feeling he'd had during his father's illness, when every unanswered phone call might mean catastrophe. He used his key, calling out as he entered. "Mom, are you here?" The house felt different. Not empty exactly, but somehow altered. He moved through the rooms systematically, checking for signs of distress or confusion. In the kitchen, he found her pill organizer, empty for today, which meant she'd taken her medications. Good. But in her bedroom, he found something that made his blood run cold. The closet was half empty, missing the practical clothes she wore for errands and doctor visits. Her suitcase, the small one they'd bought her for visiting Sarah in Denver, was gone. Michael's phone rang. Dr. Stevens' office. "Mr. Miller, this is Janet from Dr. Stevens' office. Your mother missed her appointment today, which is unusual for her. We wanted to make sure everything was all right." Michael's mouth went dry. "What appointment?" "Her routine checkup. Scheduled for 2 o'clock. It was nearly 4 p.m. Florence had been gone for hours, and she'd lied about where she was going. Michael hung up and called Sarah immediately. "She's gone," he said without preamble when Sarah answered. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean gone. Her suitcase is missing. Half her clothes are gone. She lied about having a doctor's appointment today." Michael's voice rose with each word, panic and anger warring in his chest. "Michael, slow down. Maybe she, what? Decided to take a spontaneous vacation without telling anyone? Sarah, she's 67 years old. She hasn't gone anywhere alone since Dad died. Something's wrong." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "The travel brochures," she said finally. "What travel brochures? When I was there last week, she had travel stuff spread all over the kitchen. Portuguese phrase cards. I thought she was just, I don't know, fantasizing." Michael felt the world tilt sideways. You think she actually went to Portugal? Sarah, that's insane. She wouldn't. She couldn't. But even as he said it, Michael knew it wasn't true. Their mother, the woman they dismissed as too fragile for international travel, had somehow managed to plan and execute an escape that would have impressed a teenager. "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Michael was already moving toward his car. "I'm going to the airport." 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Florence Miller looked out her airplane window at the vast expanse of dark water below. The sun was setting ahead of them, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that no photograph could capture. She'd never seen anything so beautiful or so frightening. Carol had fallen asleep in the middle seat, her guidebook open on her lap. Around them, other passengers read or watched movies or dozed, all of them treating this miracle of flight as routine. But for Florence, every moment felt extraordinary. The flight attendant stopped by their row, offering drinks and snacks. Florence asked for tea, marveling at how normal the interaction felt. She was having tea on an airplane, crossing an ocean, heading toward an adventure she'd planned entirely by herself. Her phone, tucked safely in airplane mode, contained 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. She could imagine the panic back home, Michael's fury, and Sarah's worry. The confrontation that awaited her eventual return would be epic. But that was a problem for future Florence. Present Florence was watching the sun set over the Atlantic, drinking airline tea, and talking to a friendly stranger about Portuguese music. For the first time in 2 years, maybe for the first time in decades, she was exactly where she wanted to be. The plane flew on through the night, carrying Florence Miller toward a continent she'd never seen, toward challenges she'd never imagined, toward a version of herself she was only beginning to discover. Behind her, Chicago grew smaller with each mile, along with all the voices that had told her she was too old, too fragile, too afraid to chase the dreams she'd deferred for so long. In a few hours, she would land in Lisbon and begin the most audacious adventure of her life. But right now, suspended between the world she'd known and the world she was discovering, Florence Miller allowed herself to believe that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what everyone tells you you can't. The postcards in her carry-on bag were ready to be written. 7 countries awaited. And somewhere over the dark Atlantic, a 67-year-old widow smiled and planned her first act of international defiance. That evening, Florence sat in Robert's study with his old atlas open before her. The pages were soft with age, the bindings cracked from years of dreaming. She traced the routes they'd planned but never taken, the Mediterranean cruise they'd postpone until the kids were older, the Irish countryside they'd visit when he retired, the Parisian cafe where they'd drink coffee and watch the world go by. Someday had been their favorite word. Someday when they had more money. Someday when they had more time. Someday when the children didn't need them as much. But someday had run out for Robert, and Florence was beginning to understand that it might run out for her too. She opened her laptop and navigated to the airline website she'd bookmarked earlier. The Lisbon flight was still available, the price unchanged. Her finger hovered over the Book Now button for a long moment. Florence thought about Dr. Stevens' encouraging words, about Megan's assumption that of course she could handle European travel, about Patricia's careful planning. She thought about Michael's dismissive laughter and Sarah's gentle condescension. She thought about the Portuguese phrase cards hidden in her kitchen drawer and the suitcase with working wheels tucked in her bedroom closet. Most of all, she thought about Robert. About all the dreams they'd deferred, all the adventures they'd postponed, all the postcards they'd never sent. Florence Miller clicked, "Book now." Quote dot. The confirmation email arrived 60 seconds later, containing her flight details and a booking reference number that felt like the most important combination of letters and numbers she'd ever received. She was going to Portugal. In 3 weeks, she would board a plane alone for the first time in her life and fly across an ocean to a country where she didn't speak the language. The thought terrified her. It also made her feel more alive than she had in years. Florence closed the laptop and picked up one of the blank postcards she'd bought at the travel store. She wrote carefully, her handwriting still neat despite her age. Day -21 in Chicago. Preparations underway. Still fragile, still traveling. F. She didn't address it to anyone. This first postcard was for her, a promise to herself that she would follow through on this impossible dream. She propped it against Robert's photograph on the desk, where it would remind her every day that some adventures can't be postponed forever. Outside, Chicago settled into another ordinary evening. But inside the study, where she'd spent countless hours dreaming of distant places, Florence Miller was no longer the woman her children thought they knew. She was becoming someone new, someone brave enough to send postcards from 7 countries, even if her family thought she was too fragile to travel to one. Florence's legs wobbled as she stepped off the plane into Lisbon's Humberto Delgado Airport. The overnight flight had left her disoriented and cotton-mouthed, but the rush of accomplishment was intoxicating. She had done it, crossed an ocean alone, navigated international customs, and emerged into a country where the signs were in a language she couldn't read, and the morning air smelled of salt and possibility. The airport bustled with travelers who moved with practiced efficiency while Florence stood near the baggage claim, clutching her carry-on and trying to process the reality of where she was. Portuguese conversations flowed around her like music, punctuated by announcements she couldn't understand. For a moment, the magnitude of what she'd done threatened to overwhelm her. "Excuse me, are you all right?" The voice belonged to Carol, her seatmate from the flight, who appeared at Florence's elbow, with the concerned expression of someone who recognized panic when she saw it. "I think so," Florence managed. "It's just, I'm actually here." Carol smiled. "First international trip can be overwhelming. But look." She gestured toward the arrivals board, where Chicago appeared next to their flight number. "You navigated one of the world's busiest airports, survived an 8-hour flight, and made it through Portuguese customs. You're doing better than you think." Florence's suitcase appeared on the conveyor belt, and Carol helped her retrieve it. As they walked toward the taxi stand together, Carol offered practical advice: how much to tip, which currency to use, key Portuguese phrases for getting around. The casual way she shared this information, as if Florence were obviously capable of using it, bolstered Florence's flagging confidence. "My daughter's picking me up," Carol said as they reached the taxi queue. "But you'll be fine. Portuguese people are incredibly kind to visitors. Don't be afraid to ask for help." Florence watched Carol disappear into the crowd, then turned to face the taxi driver who was loading her suitcase into his trunk. He was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent years helping confused tourists navigate his city. "Hotel, Senora?" he asked in accented English. "Hotel Dom Pedro," Florence replied, consulting the confirmation printout she'd clutched throughout the flight. The drive into Lisbon proper was a sensory overload. Hills rose and fell like frozen waves, covered in buildings that seemed to cascade toward the Tagus River. Red tile roofs caught the morning sunlight, and narrow streets wound between structures that looked centuries old. Florence pressed her face to the window, trying to absorb everything at once. "First time Lisboa?" the driver asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Yes." "Ah, beautiful city. You choose good time. Spring is perfect." He pointed toward a hillside covered in colorful buildings. "That is Alfama. Very old, very traditional. You must visit." Florence nodded, filing away this information alongside Carol's recommendation about fado music. Already, strangers were helping her feel less alone in this foreign place. The Hotel Dom Pedro was smaller than Florence had expected from the website photos, tucked into a narrow street that barely accommodated the taxi. The lobby was cramped but charming, with azulejo tiles covering the walls in intricate blue and white patterns. The desk clerk, a young woman with excellent English and infinite patience, walked Florence through the check-in process and provided a city map with recommendations circled in red ink. "The room is not ready yet," she explained, "but you can leave your luggage here and explore. Jet lag is best fought with sunlight and walking." Florence's room was on the 3rd floor, accessible only by a narrow elevator that felt more like a confession booth. But the view from her window made up for any inconvenience. Red rooftops stretched toward the river, interrupted by church spires and the occasional palm tree. It was like looking at a postcard, except she was inside the picture. She unpacked methodically, hanging her clothes in a wardrobe that smelled faintly of lavender. Each familiar item, her favorite sweater, her comfortable walking shoes, the travel-sized toiletries she'd bought at the Chicago airport, felt like a small anchor in this sea of foreignness. Her phone showed 47 missed calls and 82 text messages. The most recent was from Michael, sent 3 hours ago. "Mom, please call me. We know you're not at the doctor. We're worried sick. Whatever you're doing, we can figure it out together." Florence turned the phone off without reading the others. She wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. First, she needed to prove to herself that she could survive one day alone in a foreign country. The streets of Lisbon were steeper than Florence had anticipated. Within 2 blocks of her hotel, she was breathing hard and questioning her decision to explore on foot. But the city was so beautiful that each labored step felt worthwhile. Narrow cobblestone streets opened onto sudden vistas of the river. Cafes spilled onto sidewalks where locals lingered over tiny cups of coffee, and every corner revealed some new architectural detail that made her wish Robert could see it. She'd been walking for an hour when she realized she was lost. The hotel's business card was in her pocket, but the street signs were in Portuguese and bore no resemblance to anything on her tourist map. Panic began to creep up her throat, the familiar feeling of incompetence that Michael's voice had reinforced so many times. "Excuse me," she said to a passing woman about her age. "Do you speak English?" The woman smiled and shook her head apologetically, but she studied Florence's map and pointed up a steep street, gesturing with her hands and speaking in rapid Portuguese that somehow conveyed clear directions. When Florence looked confused, the woman simply said, "Come," and began walking. For 10 minutes, Florence followed this stranger through winding streets that all looked identical to her untrained eye. They chatted in a mixture of broken English and enthusiastic gestures, the woman pointing out landmarks and sharing what sounded like local history. When they reached a familiar intersection near Florence's hotel, the woman beamed and clasped Florence's hands. "Tourist is good," she said in careful English. "Lisboa loves tourist. You are safe here." Florence almost cried with gratitude. This stranger had spent part of her morning helping a lost American woman, asking nothing in return except the pleasure of sharing her city with someone who appreciated it. By afternoon, Florence had developed a system. She walked until she was tired, then found a cafe where she could rest and observe Portuguese life unfold around her. The coffee was stronger than she was used to, served in cups that seemed designed for dolls, but the pastries were revelatory. She'd discovered pastéis de nata, custard tarts that were somehow both simple and sophisticated, and decided they might be reason enough to stay in Lisbon forever. It was in a tiny cafe in the Alfama district that she met Jessica Thompson. Florence had been struggling with the menu, pointing at items and hoping for the best, when a voice behind her said, "The bacalhau bra is incredible if you're feeling adventurous." She turned to find a woman in her 30s with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of solo travel. Her laptop was open on a nearby table, surrounded by guidebooks and what looked like work papers. "I'm sorry," the woman continued. "I couldn't help but overhear you speaking English. American?" "Chicago," Florence replied. "Portland, originally. I'm Jess." She gestured toward the empty chair at Florence's table. "Mind if I join you? Solo dining gets old after a while." Florence found herself nodding, grateful for English conversation and the company of someone who seemed to understand the challenges of navigating foreign restaurants. Jessica, it turned out, was a travel blogger who'd been living nomadically for 8 years. She'd arrived in Lisbon 2 weeks ago and had fallen in love with the city's combination of old-world charm and modern vitality. As they shared plates of perfectly grilled sardines and talked about their favorite neighborhoods, Florence felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the easy camaraderie of adult friendship with someone who had no preconceptions about her capabilities. "So what brings you to Portugal?" Jessica asked. "Business? Vacation? Rebellion," Florence said, surprising herself with the honesty. Jessica's eyes lit up with interest rather than concern. The best kind of travel motivation. What are you rebelling against? And somehow, over coffee and custard tarts, Florence found herself telling this stranger the whole story. Michael's condescension, Sarah's gentle control, the family dinner that had sparked her great escape. Jessica listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions, treating Florence's adventure as exactly what it was, a bold choice made by a competent adult. "Your family sounds like they love you," Jessica said when Florence finished, "but they don't respect you. There's a difference." "I'm not sure they see it that way." "Of course they don't. People who control others always think they're protecting them." Jessica leaned forward conspiratorially. "But here's the thing. You're in Lisbon. You navigated international travel, found your hotel, explored the city, and you're having lunch with a new friend. You're not fragile. You're fierce." Florence felt tears pricking her eyes. When was the last time someone had called her fierce? "I should probably send them a postcard," she said. "Let them know I'm alive." "Absolutely. But make it count." Jessica grinned. "Make it clear that you're not just surviving. You're thriving." That evening, Florence sat at the small desk in her hotel room with a blank postcard featuring the colorful buildings of Alfama. The message needed to be perfect, defiant enough to make her point, but not so harsh as to cause genuine worry. She wrote carefully, "Day 1 in Lisbon. Still breathing. Still traveling. The pastéis de nata are extraordinary, and I made a friend at lunch. Portugal is even more beautiful than the guidebooks promised. F." She addressed it to Michael at his office, knowing it would take several days to arrive, giving her time to find her rhythm before the inevitable confrontation. As she sealed the postcard, Florence felt a surge of pride. She had survived her first day in a foreign country not just intact but enriched. She'd gotten lost and found her way, struggled with language barriers and discovered kindness, felt overwhelmed and pushed through to confidence. Her phone, which she'd finally turned back on to check the time, immediately buzzed with incoming messages. 17 more missed calls. Dozens of increasingly frantic texts from both children. The most recent, from Sarah, was heartbreaking in its desperation. "Mom, please just tell us you're safe. We can work everything else out later." Florence typed back, "I'm safe. In Portugal as planned. We'll call tomorrow when I'm ready to talk. Love you both." She turned the phone off again before the inevitable flood of responses could arrive. Her first dinner alone in a foreign restaurant was both terrifying and liberating. The waiter at the small tasca Jessica had recommended spoke limited English, but he was patient with Florence's attempts at Portuguese and delighted by her enthusiasm for local specialties. When she successfully ordered grilled octopus and a glass of vinho verde using phrases from her guidebook, she felt like she'd conquered Everest. The octopus was tender and perfectly seasoned, served with roasted potatoes and a salad dressed in olive oil that tasted like liquid sunshine. Florence ate slowly, savoring each bite and watching Portuguese families enjoy their evening meals around her. Children darted between tables while grandparents sipped wine and debated with animated gestures. It was exactly the kind of scene she and Robert had dreamed of witnessing together. But sitting there alone, Florence realized something unexpected. She didn't feel lonely. She felt present in a way that she hadn't experienced in years, aware of every texture and flavor and sound around her. Solo travel, she was beginning to understand, wasn't about being alone. It was about being completely yourself, without the need to accommodate anyone else's preferences or fears. As she walked back to her hotel through streets lit by traditional Portuguese lanterns, Florence Miller felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's diagnosis: pure, uncomplicated happiness. She was 67 years old, walking alone through a foreign city at night, and she felt safer and more capable than she had in her own Chicago neighborhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She planned to take the famous Tram 28 across the city, visit some museums, maybe find one of those photo houses Carol had mentioned. But tonight, she was simply a woman who had successfully navigated her first day of international adventure, who had made a friend over lunch and conquered her fear of foreign restaurants. In her small hotel room, Florence Miller prepared for sleep in a bed that wasn't hers. In a city she'd never seen before today. In a country where she barely spoke the language. And for the first time in 2 years, she fell asleep not with anxiety about tomorrow's challenges, but with excitement about tomorrow's possibilities. The postcard to Michael would arrive in Chicago in 4 days, carrying news that would shake the Miller family's assumptions about their fragile matriarch. But tonight, Florence was too busy living her adventure to worry about anyone else's reaction to it. Day 1 in Lisbon was complete. 6 more countries awaited. The train from Lisbon to Rome was Florence's first real test of independence since Jessica had suggested they travel together. As Portuguese countryside gave way to Spanish plains and then Italian hills, Florence found herself chatting easily with fellow passengers, navigating meal service and checking her itinerary with the confidence of someone who belonged in this world of international travel. Jessica had been the perfect companion for her Portuguese adventure, encouraging without being condescending, helpful without taking over. When Florence successfully ordered gelato in Italian at their first Roman cafe, Jessica's proud smile felt like a medal of honor. "You're a natural at this," Jessica said as they sat in the shadow of the Colosseum, sharing pistachio and stracciatella from tiny plastic spoons. "I've been watching you transform over the past week. You're not the same woman who got lost in Alfama." Florence considered this. "I think I'm becoming the woman I was before everyone decided I was fragile." Rome embraced Florence like an old friend. She mastered the metro system with Jessica's guidance, tossed coins into the Trevi fountain while making a wish for continued courage, and stood in the Sistine Chapel with tears streaming down her face. Each successful navigation of the city's ancient streets built her confidence incrementally. It was Jessica who created the Instagram account. "Grandma Florence needs to share her journey," Jessica announced over dinner near the Pantheon. "Your story is inspiring. People need to see that adventure has no expiration date." Florence watched, bemused, as Jessica snapped photos of her against Roman backdrops, crafting captions that transformed her escape into something heroic. Within hours, the account had hundreds of followers. Within days, thousands. Back in Chicago, Tyler Miller was scrolling through Instagram when he stumbled across his grandmother's adventure. The photos showed a woman he barely recognized, confident, radiant, standing in front of European landmarks with the kind of smile he hadn't seen since Grandpa Robert was alive. Tyler immediately called his father. "Dad, you need to see this. Grandma's Instagram is going viral." Michael's fury was immediate and impotent. His mother wasn't just defying his authority. She was broadcasting her defiance to the world. The comments were uniformly supportive. "You're my hero. Living my dream. Goals for when I'm your age." When Florence video called Tyler from her Roman hotel room, their conversation lasted 2 hours. For the first time, Tyler saw his grandmother not as a fragile widow who needed protection, but as an adventurous woman who'd simply been waiting for permission to emerge. "Dad's pretty upset about the Instagram thing," Tyler admitted. "Your father will adjust," Florence replied with newfound steel in her voice. "Or he won't. But I'm not stopping." That evening, Florence wrote her second postcard. "Rome wasn't built in a day, but I'm rebuilding myself one step at a time. The Sistine Chapel made me cry happy tears. Thank you, Michelangelo. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, courage I didn't know I had. F." She was no longer just surviving her adventure. She was starring in it. Florence's goodbye with Jessica at Rome's Termini station felt like sending a child off to college, equal parts pride and terror. For 10 days, Jessica had been her safety net, translator, and confidence coach. Now, standing alone on the platform with her suitcase and a ticket to Interlaken, Florence faced her biggest test yet, proving she could navigate international travel entirely on her own. "You've got this," Jessica had whispered during their embrace. "You're not the same woman who arrived in Lisbon 2 weeks ago." The train to Switzerland wound through landscapes that belonged on postcards. Alpine meadows dotted with wildflowers, villages that looked like movie sets, mountains that scraped the sky with snow-capped peaks. Florence pressed her face to the window like a child, marveling that this fairy tale scenery was real, and she was moving through it alone. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications from the Instagram account, which now had over 50,000 followers. People from around the world were following her journey, sharing their own stories of late-life adventures, thanking her for proving that dreams don't have expiration dates. The attention was overwhelming and wonderful in equal measure. Interlaken lived up to its name, nestled between two pristine lakes, with the Jungfrau Massif towering overhead like a cathedral made of stone and ice. Florence's hotel was a traditional Swiss chalet, where the proprietor, Herr Müller, greeted her in careful English and treated her like visiting royalty rather than a confused tourist. "First time in Switzerland?" he asked as he carried her suitcase to the tiny elevator. "First time anywhere, really. I'm 67 and finally seeing the world." Herr Müller's weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "Ah, the best adventures come to those who wait for the right moment. You have chosen well. Spring in the Alps is paradise." The next morning brought Florence's first real crisis. She planned to take the cogwheel train up to Jungfraujoch, the top of Europe, but hadn't anticipated how the altitude would affect her. Halfway up the mountain, her head began pounding and her stomach churned with nausea. The other passengers, mostly younger, fitter travelers, seemed unaffected by the climb to 11,000 feet. At the Jungfraujoch station, Florence barely made it to a bench before her legs gave out. The mountain air was thin and sharp, each breath requiring conscious effort. For the first time since leaving Chicago, she wondered if her family had been right about her limitations. "Excuse me, are you feeling all right?" A woman's voice, speaking accented English, interrupted her internal panic. Florence looked up to see a middle-aged Swiss woman in hiking gear, her expression concerned but not alarmed. "I think it's the altitude," Florence managed. "I'm not used to being this high up." "Ah yes, it affects many people. I am Dr. Zimmerman. Not working today, just hiking. But I recognize altitude sickness when I see it." She sat beside Florence, her manner calm and professional. "You are visiting from America?" "Chicago. This is my first big trip alone." Dr. Zimmerman's eyebrows rose with interest rather than concern. "At your age? How wonderful. My mother did her first solo journey at 72. Said it was the best thing she ever did for herself." For the next hour, Dr. Zimmerman helped Florence manage her altitude adjustment, sipping water slowly, breathing deeply, letting her body acclimate gradually. She shared stories of other mature adventurers she'd encountered in the Alps, treating Florence's solo journey as admirable rather than alarming. "The key," Dr. Zimmerman explained as Florence's symptoms subsided, "is knowing the difference between being careful and being afraid. You were careful to seek help when you felt unwell. That is wisdom, not weakness." When Florence finally felt steady enough to explore the observation deck, the view took her breath away in the best possible way. Glaciers stretched to the horizon like frozen rivers, surrounded by peaks that seemed to touch the sky. She stood there, 67 years old and 11,000 feet above sea level, feeling more alive than she had in decades. The cable car ride down to Grindelwald was spectacular, a journey through clouds and across valleys that made Florence feel like she was flying. At the bottom station, she successfully navigated Swiss public transport, bought a traditional Swiss dinner at a local restaurant, and even managed basic German phrases with the server. That evening, in her hotel room overlooking Lake Thun, Florence wrote her third postcard. "The view from up here is worth every difficult step. Today I learned that altitude sickness isn't a sign of weakness. It's just Switzerland's way of making sure you slow down enough to appreciate the majesty." Dr. Zimmerman was right. I'm being careful, not afraid. There's a difference. F. As she prepared for bed, Florence reflected on the day's challenges. She'd faced a real physical crisis in a foreign country and handled it with grace. She'd accepted help when needed and pushed forward when possible. Most importantly, she'd proven to herself that being cautious wasn't the same as being fragile. Her phone showed 43 new Instagram followers and dozens of encouraging comments from around the world. One message from a woman in Australia particularly moved her. "My mother is your age and thinks she's too old for adventure. I'm showing her your posts to prove her wrong. Thank you for leading the way." Florence Miller fell asleep in the Swiss Alps, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges but confident she could meet them. The scared woman who'd left Chicago 3 weeks ago was becoming someone new. someone brave enough to climb mountains, literally and figuratively. Edinburgh greeted Florence with the kind of dramatic weather that made her understand why poets wrote about Scotland. Rain misted the ancient stones of the Royal Mile while shafts of sunlight broke through storm clouds, illuminating the castle perched on its volcanic rock like something from a fairy tale. After the pristine efficiency of Switzerland, Scotland felt wild and romantic, a country that wore its history like a comfortable old coat. Florence had booked 3 nights in a small hotel near the Grassmarket, drawn by online reviews that praised its, quote, authentic Scottish character. What the reviews hadn't mentioned was that authentic Scottish character included narrow stairs, temperamental plumbing, and windows that rattled with every gust of Highland wind. But her room overlooked cobblestones that had been walked by Mary Queen of Scots, and that historical connection made every inconvenience feel like part of the adventure. She'd planned to spend her first morning exploring the castle, but Edinburgh's literary heritage proved irresistible. A walking tour called Writers and Whiskey promised to trace the footsteps of Robert Louis Stevenson and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle through the city's closes and wynds. Florence joined a small group of fellow literary pilgrims at the Deacon's House Café, a narrow establishment tucked into a building that predated the American Revolution. That's where she met William Paterson. He was seated alone at a corner table, reading what appeared to be a first edition of something important, while nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago. Distinguished was the word that came to Florence's mind, silver-haired and tweedy in the way that suggested academic credentials rather than fashion choices. When their tour guide mentioned that the café had been a favorite haunt of Edinburgh's literary society, this man looked up with the kind of smile that suggested he had stories to tell. "First time hearing about Deacon Brodie?" he asked Florence as they waited for the tour to begin. "I'm afraid so. I'm still learning about Scottish history." "Ah, a fellow student then." "I'm Bill Paterson, retired professor, trying to see all the places I spent 40 years teaching about, but never visited." His voice carried the slight formality of New England academia, but his eyes held genuine warmth. Florence found herself responding with unusual openness. "Florence Miller. I'm 67 and finally seeing the world my husband and I always planned to explore together." "Exploring alone takes a different kind of courage," Bill said. "I've been widowed 3 years now, and I'm still learning the difference between solitude and loneliness." There was something in his tone, understanding without self-pity, that immediately put Florence at ease. Here was someone who knew the particular grief of losing a life partner, the strange liberation and terror of making decisions alone after decades of consultation. The literary tour wound through Edinburgh's Old Town, past the Writers' Museum, and up the Royal Mile to St. Giles Cathedral. Bill walked beside Florence naturally, their conversation flowing from Scottish literature to American history to the peculiar challenges of late-life travel. He had taught American colonial history at Boston University for 38 years, she learned, and had always promised his wife Margaret that they'd tour the battlefields and castles he'd described in countless lectures. Margaret developed Alzheimer's when she was 68, Bill said as they paused outside the house where Robert Louis Stevenson was born. "By the time I retired to care for her, traveling was no longer possible. She died 2 summers ago, and I decided I couldn't postpone these pilgrimages any longer." Florence understood immediately. "My husband Robert had cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to death. We kept saying we'd travel when he felt better, when the treatments were finished, when we had more time." "And then time ran out," Bill finished gently. "Yes, exactly." They broke away from the tour group and spent the afternoon exploring Edinburgh on their own. Bill's knowledge of Scottish history brought the city alive in ways no guidebook could match. He explained the significance of the closes that branched off the Royal Mile, told her about the body snatchers who had once operated from the city's graveyards, and shared the story of Greyfriars Bobby with the kind of detail that made Florence feel like she was receiving a private university lecture. But it wasn't his knowledge that drew her. It was the way he listened when she talked about her own journey. When Florence described her family's reaction to her travel plans, Bill's expression shifted from interest to something that looked like recognition and respect. "They called you fragile," he said. It wasn't a question. Among other things. My son thinks I've lost my mind. My daughter thinks I'm having some sort of breakdown. Are you? Florence considered this seriously. I don't think so. I think I'm having a breakthrough instead. Bill smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen from him. Good for you. The world needs more women having breakthroughs instead of breakdowns. That evening, Bill invited Florence to dinner at a traditional Scottish restaurant, where the haggis was authentic and the whiskey selection extensive. Over neeps and tatties, they shared stories of their marriages, their children's well-meaning interference, and the unexpected freedom of making decisions based solely on their own desires. I have 3 adult children, Bill said, and they all think I should be settling into some sort of dignified decline. Golf, maybe. Volunteer work at the library. Certainly nothing as reckless as traveling alone to foreign countries. Reckless, Florence repeated, tasting the word. When did following your dreams become reckless? I think it happened gradually. Somewhere between becoming parents and becoming grandparents, we stopped being people with our own aspirations and became people whose primary job was being available for everyone else's needs. Florence felt something shift in her chest, a recognition so profound it was almost physical. I haven't been unavailable to my family in 45 years. Even when Robert was dying, even when I was exhausted and scared, I was still managing everyone else's emotions. And now? Now I'm in Scotland, having dinner with a charming professor, and my family is furious that they can't reach me whenever they want. Bill raised his whiskey glass. To unavailability. To unavailability, Florence echoed, clinking her glass against his. They walked back through the old town together, past street musicians and late-night revelers, the conversation flowing as easily as if they'd known each other for decades rather than hours. At her hotel door, Bill hesitated. I don't want to presume, he said carefully, but I'm planning to visit the Highlands tomorrow. Stirling Castle, maybe Loch Lomond. It would be lovely to have company, if you're interested. Florence felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. Not just interest, but anticipation. When was the last time a man had asked her to spend a day with him? When was the last time she'd felt attractive enough to warrant such an invitation? I'd like that very much, she said. Their second day together was even better than the first. Bill rented a car, something Florence would never have attempted. And they drove through Highland scenery that looked like every romantic movie ever made. At Stirling Castle, he explained the significance of Robert the Bruce and William Wallace, with the passion of someone who'd spent decades making history come alive for students. At Loch Lomond, they shared fish and chips from a waterfront pub and watched swans glide across water that reflected the surrounding mountains like a mirror. But it was the quiet moments that surprised Florence most. Bill's hand helping her navigate uneven castle steps. His patient explanation of Scottish clan history without any hint that he was talking down to her. The way he asked her opinion about everything from restaurant choices to driving routes, treating her as an equal partner in their shared adventure. That evening, walking along Edinburgh's Princes Street as the sun set behind the castle, Bill stopped suddenly. Florence, I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but I haven't enjoyed anyone's company this much in years. Margaret was the love of my life, and I thought that chapter was finished for me. But spending these 2 days with you, I feel like myself again, the best version of myself. Florence looked at this kind, intelligent man, who saw her as someone worth courting, rather than someone who needed protection. I feel the same way. I thought romance was something that happened to other people, younger people. I thought that part of my life ended when Robert died. Maybe it did, Bill said gently. Maybe this is something entirely new. He kissed her then, softly and tentatively, on a street corner in Edinburgh, while tourists and locals streamed around them. Florence kissed him back, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. Later, in her hotel room, Florence wrote her 4th postcard. Scotland has shown me that some chapters of life are worth writing twice. The Highlands are magnificent, the history is fascinating, and sometimes the most unexpected gifts come disguised as literary walking tours. Bill says hello. He's the charming professor I mentioned. Love finds us when we're not looking for it, doesn't it? F. As she prepared for bed, Florence reflected on the day's revelations. She was a 67-year-old widow who had just been kissed by a 72-year-old widower in a foreign country, and she felt like a teenager with her first crush. The woman her family thought too fragile for solo travel was discovering she wasn't too fragile for romance either. Bill had invited her to continue traveling together. Greece, perhaps, or Spain. The invitation was tempting, but Florence knew she needed to complete this journey on her own terms. She had started this adventure to prove her independence. She couldn't abandon it now for the comfort of companionship, no matter how wonderful that companionship might be. But she also knew that this wasn't goodbye. Some connections transcend geography and timing. Whatever was beginning between her and Bill Patterson would survive her need to finish what she'd started. For the first time since Robert's death, Florence Miller fell asleep, thinking about the future rather than the past. And for the first time in her adult life, that future felt entirely her own to write. Athens hit Florence like a wall of heat and history. After Scotland's cool mists and Bill Patterson's gentle company, Greece felt overwhelming in its intensity. The blazing Mediterranean sun, the cacophony of traffic and construction, the weight of 25 centuries of civilization pressing down on every street corner. She'd been traveling for 5 weeks now, but standing in Syntagma Square with her guidebook and a bottle of water, Florence felt like a novice again. The souvlaki from a street vendor near the Acropolis was her first mistake. Florence had navigated Portuguese seafood and Swiss fondue without incident, but something about the lamb, or perhaps the July heat, didn't agree with her system. By evening, she was violently ill in her hotel room, alternating between fever and chills, while her stomach rebelled against everything she'd eaten in the past 24 hours. Food poisoning in a foreign country was the scenario Michael had warned her about, the exact kind of crisis that proved she was too fragile for solo travel. But as Florence lay in her narrow hotel bed, too weak to reach for the water bottle on the nightstand, she discovered something unexpected. She wasn't panicking. Even through the haze of illness, her mind remained clear and focused. She needed medical attention, and she needed it in Greek. The hotel desk clerk, a young man named Dimitri, spoke excellent English and treated Florence's predicament with professional concern rather than alarm. "There is a clinic very close," he explained, already calling for a taxi. "Dr. Papadopoulos speaks English well. She will take good care of you." The clinic was small but modern, staffed by a middle-aged doctor who examined Florence with brisk efficiency and diagnosed severe gastroenteritis without making her feel foolish for eating street food. Dr. Papadopoulos administered IV fluids and anti-nausea medication while maintaining a steady stream of reassuring conversation. "First time in Greece?" she asked as she adjusted Florence's IV. "Yes, though I wouldn't recommend this particular introduction to your healthcare system." Dr. Papadopoulos laughed. "You are handling this very well. Many tourists panic when they get sick abroad. You are calm, practical. This is good." Florence spent 6 hours at the clinic, gradually rehydrating and regaining her strength. During that time, she met an elderly Greek woman named Sophia who was receiving treatment for a minor ailment. Despite the language barrier, Sophia insisted on sharing her homemade cookies and practicing her limited English with Florence. "You travel alone?" Sophia asked, her weathered face creasing with interest. "Yes, my first big adventure." "Good. Woman must have adventure. I travel alone to visit my sister in Canada when I am 70. Children say no, too dangerous. But I go anyway." Sophia's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Children worry too much. We are strong, yes?" "Yes," Florence agreed, feeling stronger with each passing hour. The crisis coincided with another emergency back in Chicago. Sarah had finally confronted Michael about his controlling behavior, leading to a family argument that had been building for weeks. When Florence's phone rang at the clinic, she almost didn't answer, but the persistence of the calls suggested genuine urgency. "Mom, where are you?" Sarah's voice was tight with stress. "We've been trying to reach you all day. I'm at a medical clinic in Athens. I got food poisoning, but I'm fine now. Getting excellent care." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then Michael's voice, apparently on speakerphone. "Mom, This is exactly what we were afraid of. You're sick, alone, in a country where you don't speak the language. We're booking flights to come get you." Florence felt her carefully maintained calm crack slightly. "You're going to do what?" "We're coming to Athens. This has gone far enough. You've proven your point, but now it's time to come home, where you can be properly cared for." "Michael?" Florence's voice carried a steel that surprised even her. "I am being properly cared for by qualified medical professionals who speak English and have treated thousands of tourists with similar ailments. I don't need to be rescued." "Mom, you're 67 years old with food poisoning in a foreign country. This isn't about being independent. It's about being realistic." "No," Florence said firmly. "This is about you being unable to accept that I'm a competent adult who can handle temporary setbacks without falling apart. I got sick, I sought appropriate medical care, and I'm recovering. That's exactly what I would do in Chicago." Sarah's voice was gentler but equally concerned. "Mom, we're just worried about you. You're so far from home, and if something serious happened—" "Something serious did happen," Florence interrupted. "I handled it, without you. Without Michael. Without anyone making decisions for me or treating me like I'm incapable of managing my own health." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I love you both, but I will not be coming home early. I will not be rescued. I'm finishing this trip on my own terms." "Mom," Michael began. "No." Florence's voice was final. "I'm hanging up now. I'll call you when I'm feeling better, but not to be managed or controlled. I'm going to finish seeing Greece, then Spain, then Paris. You can accept that or not, but you cannot change it." She ended the call before either of them could respond. Dr. Papadopoulos, who had been pretending not to listen, smiled approvingly. "Family can be very loving and very difficult, yes? Sometimes the same thing." That evening, back in her hotel room with a bottle of rehydration salts and strict instructions about gradual food reintroduction, Florence wrote her 5th postcard. "Even when I'm down, I'm not defeated. Today I learned that getting sick abroad isn't a catastrophe. It's just another problem to solve. Dr. Papadopoulos and Sophia at the clinic reminded me that women are stronger than the world likes to admit. Athens is still beautiful, even through the haze of gastroenteritis. The crisis had tested every aspect of her newfound independence, her ability to navigate foreign healthcare, communicate across language barriers, and resist family pressure to abandon her journey. She had passed with flying colors. Florence Miller fell asleep in Athens, knowing that she had faced her family's worst fears and emerged victorious. She was no longer proving she could travel alone. She was proving she could live alone, make decisions alone, and handle whatever life threw at her. The scared woman who had left Chicago was becoming someone new, someone unshakable. Barcelona overwhelmed Florence in the best possible way. After the ancient solemnity of Athens, Gaudi's whimsical architecture felt like stepping into a child's dream made manifest. The Sagrada Familia twisted toward the sky in impossible spirals, Park Güell cascaded down hillsides in mosaics of broken tile, and the entire city seemed to pulse with an energy that made Florence feel decades younger. But as she sat in a café on Las Ramblas, watching street performers and tourists flow past like a human river, Florence felt something unexpected. Homesickness. Not for Chicago exactly, but for the familiar rhythms of a life that belonged to her. 6 weeks of constant adaptation, of navigating foreign languages and customs, of proving herself capable in new situations every day, had left her emotionally exhausted in ways she hadn't anticipated. The Instagram account Jessica had created now boasted over 200,000 followers. Comments poured in from around the world. Elderly women sharing their own delayed adventures, younger people thanking Florence for redefining what aging could look like, families reconciling with parents they'd been overprotecting. The attention was gratifying but overwhelming. Florence had become a symbol of something larger than herself, and the weight of representing late-life independence sometimes felt heavier than her small-wheeled suitcase. It was in this state of melancholy triumph that she found Casa Esperanza, a small bed and breakfast tucked into the narrow streets of the Gothic Quarter. The building was 4 stories of weathered stone and wrought iron balconies, with bougainvillea cascading from window boxes like purple waterfalls. The proprietor who answered the door was a woman about Florence's age, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and the kind of direct gaze that suggested hard-won wisdom. "Welcome to Casa Esperanza," the woman said in lightly accented English. "I am Betty Washington and you must be Florence Miller. I've been following your journey online." Florence blinked in surprise. "You know who I am?" "Honey, half the women over 60 in the Western world know who you are. You're the grandmother who told her family to stuff it and went gallivanting across Europe by herself." Betty's grin was infectious. "Come on in. I've been looking forward to meeting you." Betty Washington turned out to be exactly what Florence needed, a kindred spirit who had walked a similar path 15 years earlier. Originally from Atlanta, Betty had moved to Barcelona after her divorce, using her nursing background to reinvent herself as a hospitality entrepreneur. Casa Esperanza was her baby, a carefully curated haven for travelers who appreciated charm over luxury. "My kids thought I'd lost my mind," Betty confided over homemade gazpacho that evening. They sat on the building's rooftop terrace, overlooking the Gothic quarter as the sun set behind the cathedral spires. 45 years old, divorced, moving to a country where I barely spoke the language. My eldest son actually flew to Barcelona to stage an intervention. What did you do? Took him to the airport and put him on the next plane home. Betty's laugh was rich and unapologetic. Told him he could visit when he was ready to treat me like an adult, instead of a problem to be solved. Florence felt a recognition so sharp it was almost physical. How long before he came around? 3 years. But when he finally visited, he brought his wife and kids. Said he was proud of what I'd built here. Betty refilled Florence's wineglass. "The thing is, Florence, they had to learn to respect me as a person, not just love me as their mother. Those are two different things." Over the next 2 days, Betty became Florence's unofficial therapist and tour guide. She showed Florence the hidden courtyards of the Barrio Gótico, introduced her to the vendors at the Boqueria market who had become her chosen family, and shared the story of how she'd built a successful business from scratch in a foreign country where she'd initially been viewed with suspicion. The hardest part wasn't learning Spanish or figuring out Spanish business regulations, Betty explained as they walked through Park Güell, admiring Gaudi's mosaic benches. It was learning to trust my own judgment again. When you've spent decades making decisions based on what everyone else thinks is best for you, it takes time to remember what you actually want. "I'm starting to understand that," Florence said. "This whole trip has been about proving I could do it, but I'm not sure I know what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" Florence considered this as they paused at a viewpoint overlooking the city. Barcelona spread below them in terracotta and stone, the Mediterranean glittering in the distance. "I want to keep traveling. I want to see Bill again, the professor I met in Scotland. I want to maintain the relationships I've built with Jessica and Dr. Stevens, and even you, but I also want to go home eventually and figure out how to be this new version of myself in my old life." "That's the real challenge," Betty agreed. "Anyone can be brave for 6 weeks in foreign countries. The trick is being brave for the rest of your life in familiar places." That evening, Florence received a video call from Tyler that changed everything. Her grandson appeared on her phone screen with the kind of excitement that made him look 12 years old again. "Grandma, you have to see this," he said, holding up his laptop. "Your Instagram post from the Sagrada Familia has been shared by Ellen DeGeneres, and Good Morning America wants to interview you when you get back. And there's a woman in Australia who started her own solo travel blog because of you, and she's already been to 5 countries. Florence stared at the screen, overwhelmed. "Tyler, I just wanted to prove to your father that I could take care of myself. You did that weeks ago, Grandma. Now you're proving it to the whole world. Do you know how many women have tagged me in posts about their own late-life adventures? You started something." After the call ended, Florence sat on her small balcony overlooking the Gothic quarter, processing this information. She'd set out to rebel against her family's limitations, and had accidentally become a spokesperson for a movement she hadn't known existed. Betty appeared with 2 glasses of wine and settled into the adjacent chair. Heavy thoughts? I feel like I'm carrying more weight than when I started. All these people are watching me, following my journey, drawing inspiration from my choices. What if I disappoint them? Honey, Betty said gently, you think those women are following you because you're perfect? They're following you because you're real. You got food poisoning in Greece and handled it. You got homesick in Barcelona and admitted it. You're not performing independence. You're living it messily and imperfectly and courageously. That night, Florence wrote her 6th postcard. Barcelona has taught me that reinvention isn't just possible, it's necessary. Betty Washington showed me that the brave choice isn't always the dramatic one. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to keep being yourself, even when everyone else has opinions about who that should be. One more country to go, and then the real adventure begins, taking this new me home. As she prepared for her final destination, Florence reflected on how much had changed since that disastrous family dinner in Chicago. She'd proven she could navigate foreign countries, handle medical emergencies, resist family pressure, and inspire strangers. But the greatest transformation was internal. She'd remembered who she was before everyone else decided who she should be. Paris awaited, along with the inevitable return to Chicago and the family dynamics she'd left behind. But Florence Miller was no longer the woman who had fled those dynamics. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned the difference between being loved and being respected. The final test wouldn't be surviving another foreign city. It would be surviving the return home without losing the person she'd become. Paris embraced Florence like a long-awaited lover. The city she'd dreamed about for decades exceeded every expectation. The Seine flowing like liquid silver past ancient bridges, the Eiffel Tower rising from the Champ de Mars like an iron exclamation point, the café culture that made sitting and watching the world go by feel like high art. This was the city she and Robert had planned to visit for their 40th anniversary, the place where they'd promised to drink wine and eat croissants and pretend to be sophisticated travelers. Now Florence sat alone at a sidewalk café in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, ordering coffee in carefully practiced French and feeling more sophisticated than she'd ever imagined possible. The waiter, a young man with the kind of effortless elegance that seemed uniquely Parisian, treated her with the same attention he'd give to any customer, neither condescending nor overly solicitous. Just another woman enjoying her morning coffee and croissant, which was exactly what Florence wanted to be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Bill Patterson. Thinking of you in the city of light. I'm in Boston, planning my next adventure. Would love to hear about yours when you're ready to share. No pressure, just affection. B. Florence smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. In the 6 weeks since Edinburgh, they'd exchanged messages regularly. Updates about her travels, stories from his return to Boston, gentle flirtation that made her feel like a woman rather than just a mother or grandmother. He'd respected her need to complete this journey alone while making it clear that he hoped to be part of whatever came next. She typed back, Paris is magical. Having my last European breakfast before flying home tomorrow. The real adventure begins when I land in Chicago. We'll call you soon. The Louvre overwhelmed her with its vastness and beauty. Florence spent hours wandering through halls filled with human creativity spanning millennia, stopping frequently to rest on benches where she could absorb the magnitude of what surrounded her. The Mona Lisa was smaller than expected but more mysterious, the Venus de Milo more powerful. In the Egyptian wing, she found herself crying at the beauty of artifacts that had survived thousands of years, thinking about the continuity of human experience across time and culture. That afternoon, she climbed the stairs to Sacré-Cœur, her legs protesting the steep ascent through Montmartre, but her spirit soaring with each step. At the top, Paris spread below her in all its chaotic glory, a city that had survived revolution and war and countless transformations while maintaining its essential character. Florence felt a kinship with this place that had reinvented itself repeatedly while holding on to its core identity. As the sun set over the city of light, Florence made a decision that surprised even her. She called the airline and extended her stay by 3 days. Not because she was afraid to go home, but because she could. Because she was a competent adult who could change her plans when she wanted to, without asking permission or providing elaborate justifications. The call to her family was inevitable. I'm extending my stay in Paris, she announced when Sarah answered the phone. Mom, you've been gone for 7 weeks. Don't you think it's time to come home? I'll be home on Saturday instead of Wednesday. I want to see more of the city. Sarah's sigh was audible across the Atlantic. Michael's been planning a welcome home dinner. He's invited Dr. Stevens and some of your friends from church. Everyone's excited to see you. Florence felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. A welcome home dinner sounded suspiciously like a celebration designed to mark the end of her adventure and the return to her previous life. That's very sweet, but I'd prefer something smaller. Just family. Mom, people have been following your journey. They want to celebrate with you. Then we'll have a party later, when I'm ready for one. Florence's voice carried the authority she'd developed over 7 weeks of making her own decisions. I need time to decompress before I'm ready to be everyone's inspiration. After she hung up, Florence walked along the Seine as the city lights reflected in the dark water. She thought about the woman who had left Chicago 2 months ago. Scared, defensive, desperate to prove her competence to children who had forgotten she possessed any. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone Florence had known once, but had outgrown. The question was, how do you maintain a transformation when you return to the exact circumstances that had made the transformation necessary? Her final day in Paris was perfect. She visited the Musée d'Orsay, took a boat tour on the Seine, and spent her last evening at a tiny bistro where the owner, a woman about her age, shared stories of her own late-life reinvention. Madame Dubois had opened the restaurant at 60 after her husband's death, learning to cook professionally and managing the business side with the help of YouTube tutorials and stubborn determination. The secret, Madame Dubois confided over wine and cheese, is to remember that growing older means growing into yourself, not growing smaller. You have become more, Florence, not less. That night, Florence wrote her 7th and final postcard. Paris and I are more beautiful than I ever imagined. This city taught me that transformation isn't about becoming someone new. It's about becoming more fully yourself. Coming home changed, but not finished changing. The adventure continues. O'Hare Airport felt both foreign and familiar as Florence's plane touched down on a gray Chicago morning. She'd left as a nervous first-time traveler and returned as someone who moved through international terminals with easy confidence. The customs agent stamped her passport with the kind of routine efficiency that made her 7-country journey feel simultaneously monumental and ordinary. Michael and Sarah waited at the arrivals gate, holding a small welcome home sign and wearing expressions that mixed relief, pride, and apprehension. Florence saw them before they spotted her, and for a moment she observed them as strangers might, a middle-aged lawyer and his artistic sister, both carrying the particular tension of people who had spent weeks worrying about something beyond their control. Then Sarah saw her, and her face broke into a smile that was pure joy. "Mom!" The embrace was fierce and emotional, weeks of worry and pride and admiration pouring out in tears and laughter. Michael joined them, his own relief evident as he held his mother for the first time in nearly 2 months. "You look..." Sarah stepped back, studying Florence's face. "You look different. Stronger." "I feel different," Florence replied honestly. Michael's examination was more analytical. "You look healthy. Did you lose weight?" "I walked a lot. And I stopped eating for comfort and started eating for pleasure." Florence smiled at her son's concerned expression. "It's a good thing, Michael." The drive home was filled with questions. Some about practical matters. How was the food? Were the hotels safe? Did she have trouble with the language? Others about the emotional journey. Was she lonely? Was she scared? What was her favorite place? Florence answered carefully, sharing enough to satisfy their curiosity, while maintaining the privacy she'd learned to value. Her house looked smaller than she remembered, but it felt like home in a way she hadn't expected. The familiar furniture and photographs seemed to welcome her back, but they also felt like artifacts from a previous life. The woman who had lived here 2 months ago had been someone else. Someone who let other people make her decisions, who accepted limitations without question, who had forgotten she was capable of adventure. That evening, over Chinese takeout at her kitchen table, the real conversation began. "Mom," Michael said carefully, "we need to talk about what comes next." Florence set down her chopsticks. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this was an incredible adventure. You proved your point, proved you're capable of more than we gave you credit for, but now you're home, and we need to figure out how to move forward." "Move forward from what?" Sarah jumped in, her voice gentle but firm. "Mom, you scared us, not just with the travel, but with the way you left. The lying, the secrecy, the way you cut off communication when you were sick in Greece. We can't go through that again." Florence felt the familiar weight of their well-meaning control settling over her like a heavy blanket. "So what are you suggesting?" "Better communication," Michael said. "If you want to travel again, we plan it together. We make sure you have support systems in place, that someone knows where you are at all times. We work as a family. You want to manage my future travel plans. We want to be included in them," Sarah corrected. "Mom, you're not the same person who left Chicago, but neither are we. Watching you on Instagram, seeing you handle challenges we thought would overwhelm you, it changed how we see you. But it also showed us how much we love you and how terrifying it is to feel disconnected from your life." Florence looked at her children, these adults she'd raised, who loved her deeply and wanted to protect her, even when that protection felt like diminishment. She could see the genuine fear in their eyes, the love that motivated their desire to stay connected to her adventures. She could also see the assumptions underlying their request, that her independence was something to be managed rather than respected, that her competence was conditional rather than absolute. "I understand that you were scared," Florence said finally, "but your fear doesn't give you the right to control my choices. I'm 67 years old. I've raised 2 children, managed a household through multiple recessions, and nursed your father through 18 months of terminal illness. I've proven I can handle international travel, medical emergencies, and family pressure. I don't need your permission to live my life." Michael's face tightened. "Mom, that's not what we're asking for, isn't it? You want to be included in planning my future travels. You want better communication, which sounds like regular check-ins and itineraries. You want support systems, which sounds like people watching over me. How is that different from the control I left Chicago to escape?" Sarah leaned forward. "Because now we know you're capable. We're not asking you to be smaller. We're asking you to let us be part of your bigness." The phrase stopped Florence short. Let them be part of her bigness. Not diminish it, not manage it, but participate in it. "What would that look like?" Florence asked. "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "But maybe we start with honesty. You tell us when you're planning adventures, and we tell you when we're scared without trying to stop you. Maybe we find ways to be supportive without being controlling." Michael nodded reluctantly. "I spent 7 weeks terrified that something would happen to you, and I'd never get to apologize for treating you like you were incapable. I don't want to do that again." Florence felt something shift in the room. Not a return to the old dynamic, but the possibility of something new. "I'm planning to see Bill Patterson again, the professor I met in Scotland. We're talking about traveling together." Both her children tensed slightly, but neither objected immediately. "Tell us about him," Sarah said. Florence spent the next hours sharing stories about Bill. His kindness, his intelligence, the way he treated her as an equal rather than someone who needed protection. She watched her children process this information, saw them struggling with the idea of their mother as a woman capable of romance rather than just a widow to be managed. "I'd like to meet him," Sarah said finally. "Me too," Michael added, though his voice carried more reservation. "You will," Florence promised, "but on my terms, when I'm ready." 3 months later, Florence Miller hosted a dinner party in her Chicago home. Bill Patterson had flown in from Boston, bringing flowers and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he understood the significance of meeting Florence's family. Jessica Thompson had extended her travels to include a Chicago visit, documenting the reunion for the Instagram account that had become a platform for late-life adventure stories. Dr. Stevens attended with her husband, along with Tyler and his girlfriend, who had driven down from Northwestern. The evening was a celebration of transformation, not just Florence's journey across 7 countries, but the evolution of her relationship with her children. Michael still worried, but he'd learned to express concern without trying to control. Sarah had become Florence's closest confidant, someone who celebrated her mother's independence while offering support when it was wanted, rather than needed. As they sat around the table where the original confrontation had taken place, Florence looked at the faces of people who had learned to see her as she truly was. Not fragile, not someone to be managed, but a woman who had chosen courage over comfort and inspired others to do the same. Bill reached for her hand under the table, and Florence squeezed back, knowing that her adventure was far from over. Tomorrow, they would begin planning their next journey together, equals in partnership, companions in exploration, proof that the best chapters of life are often the ones you write when everyone else thinks the story should be ending. The postcards from her European adventure were framed and displayed throughout her house, reminders of the woman she'd discovered she could be. But the most important postcard was the one she'd never sent, the one she'd written to herself on that first night in Robert's study. Day -21 in Chicago. Preparations underway. Still fragile, still traveling. She'd kept that postcard on her desk for months after returning, a reminder of how far she'd come. But recently, she'd replaced it with a new one, written in Bill's study in Boston during one of their weekend visits. Day 127 post-adventure. No longer fragile, always traveling. The journey continues. Florence Miller had sent postcards from 7 countries, but the most important message she'd delivered was to herself, that age is just a number, that courage has no expiration date, and that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone is underestimate them. The woman who had once been dismissed as too fragile to travel alone was now planning adventures that would take her around the world. And this time, she wasn't asking for permission. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.